Okay, here we go. Ladies of Dragonlance. This piece is done on the painting itself is 24 by 36 inches, and it's done on a masonite panel that has been gessoed at this point, and the pencil drawing has been transferred via the lucograph already. So beginning here with the underpainting, and something that I like to start with when I'm painting faces, I just like to get the eyes, just to put the couple of dots in and get them to feel like they're looking and facing in the same direction. I mean, I think that's important right from the start. And even though, as you lay things in, things may get a little wonky and have to be corrected, that's kind of something that I try and keep an eye on through the process. I'm using my standard underpainting colors here, which are white, burnt sienna, burnt umber, and lamp black. With laying in, this is a fairly complicated piece as far as there's a lot of detail to the outfits. It's 4 figures. So having that much value really helps me to delineate things as I'm putting value down on the piece. I'm trying to, through each stage is just trying to get things a step further. It's, unlike a plein air approach, I'm not trying to take I'm not trying to get the finish right away. So each phase is just a stepping stone to the next one. So really it's about identifying all the different parts of the costumes and, obviously getting some value laid in. There are times with the underpainting where there are several kind of approaches that I use. Sometimes I am thinning the paint down with thinner and liquid. I've talked about this before, but in this brown phase, these earth tones generally dry quickly anyway, but I like to add liquid and thinner to them also, because it really helps the subsequent layers of paint dry. And of course, the underpainting itself is dry as a bone the next day, even a few hours later with these colors. Sometimes the white is really the most difficult to have dry quickly. So, I'm trying to be pretty mindful again about the eyes, the eyebrows, the shape of Kitty Ara's head, and but not to the point where, at a certain point I'm ready to move on. I know I'm only going to be able to take it so far with these colors and this sort of technique that I'm using. It is one that's kind of designed for speed. So it's not about getting every little thing perfect. You can see it, when I work on her armor, the different values do help break up things that will be later represented as black. There are parts of her outfit that are blue. And just having more value and color to choose from in an underpainting palette, to me, it just really helps. It just helps me a lot move this thing along at this stage. I'm also, setting myself up to do some glazing later. I'm leaving all of the gold areas just white for now, and we'll see how we handle that, and we'll talk about that when we get there. For I'm using, I think this is a number 2, a number 1 or a number 2 round. This is kind of one of my main detail brushes. I don't, I do go one smaller than this, but I usually don't use real tiny 000 brushes or things like that anymore. You can get a fairly fine point on these, and I just think that you can get carried away with the amount of detail with some of the small brushes. At least for me, that's sort of a personal choice. But you can see here as I start to work on Tika, on her face, you can see that there's some difference. The red in her hair looks different from the brown gloves of Kitiara behind her. Now, Kitiara's gloves will eventually be black, but just, again, in the underpainting, it's allowing me to define some of these things, you know, and take them from just being white gesso and a little bit of lined pencil into something that's a little more fully realized. You know, also, I want to talk a little bit about, you know, where I start in the painting. You know, that can be a little arbitrary from painting to painting. I usually try and start on the subject, whatever that is, or, you know, an area that I think is going to draw the eye. I think because I want to get the detail, some of the detail areas in first, and then there may be areas that I want to kind of just have represented as brush strokes or be a little more thrown away. They're just sort of devices to help create focus in the piece down the road. So, you know, in this piece, for example, I mean, I'm starting on the figures. Now, we've got 4 of them, so I sort of have to work my way through this a little bit. But it really is the ladies here that, you know, are going to make or break this piece. And you can see, you know, again, I like to try and, you know, keep being aware of the drawing as I'm working through the faces, the eyes looking in the same direction. You know, this is important. It's important, especially in a portrait, that you're not, you know, that these eyes don't look wonky and things like that. So the time that I take to kind of noodle these around, to me, I get them to a point where I feel like it's okay to leave it alone and let it dry. It's not that I necessarily feel like it's perfect, but I feel like I'm okay to go on to the next phase. Now, you know, after we get all the brown in, obviously the next phase will be just starting the color. So that'll give me another chance to correct a little bit. But you can see that I spend a pretty decent amount of time noodling around the faces as opposed to, say, the armor and some of that stuff, which I can move through pretty quickly. The other thing that I should talk about with using a thin down wash of color, sometimes you'll see that I'll lay in an area with a thin wash and then work out of it, is that thin wash will have medium in it. You know, in this case, it's the liquid and the thinner. Later on in the painting, it might just be linseed oil. But what that does is it gives you a layer to work into so that you're essentially working wet into wet. So in some of these cases, you'll see where I'll tint the thing down with the burnt sienna color and then go in and add darks or chiaroscuro out lights out of that. Yeah, but it just gives me, you know, a wet painting surface, something that I can blend edges into. There's also an opportunity with this underpainting technique or this approach to correct things that, you know, were kind of left to be figured out down the road. And, you know, by that I mean that, you know, I know that I'm only going to be able to take this linear pencil outline so far, and that to a large degree the form is going to come when I start the underpainting process. So you know, I don't fight the pencil drawing. I'm not trying to use, I don't use a lot of different leads, different weight of graphite and things like that to create the value structure that I'm getting out of the oil paint. To me, the oil paint, it's just easier to do it there, and it also provides some support for the subsequent layers of oil paint. So there's a few reasons for doing it this way. But you can see where there are areas that are just flat shapes that I've left in the graphite linear drawing that I resolve quite a bit more as we move through the underpainting. Now here you can see as I get down, I'm working on Lorana. You know, there's a few things about her outfit that I hadn't quite worked out, you know, even under the Lucigraph at that point, or in the in the Photoshop studies that I did that I'm using for reference that you can see off to the side. So I'm looking at some of the classic illustrations that were done of her and working in a few daggers and the hilt on this broadsword that she carries. You know, I do fix the drawing usually, but I don't get too carried away with fixative. I found that sometimes too much fixative can create the subsequent layers of oil to beat up a little on the thing. So I use usually like an H or maybe an HB pencil. It's not a very soft lead, so it doesn't smear tremendously into the paint. And if it does a little bit, then again the liquid and the thinner layer of the underpainting kind of mush it all together and lock it down. Again, here working with the full palette that I have rather than just burnt umber, you'll be able to see where, you know, a lot of the figures have this grayish white fur on their outfit somewhere, and it's an opportunity to get some edges into that without you know, that just aren't as watercolory sort of looking. You know, it's going to be done with opaque lights, white paint in this case. I want to take a second just to say that if you have any questions about anything that I'm talking about, you know, please leave them in the comments and I'd be happy to answer them. You know, going back to the sort of chronological order that I approach things in, you know, again, it's kind of arbitrary, but, you know, sometimes it's as simple as I'm working with, you know, this dark brown element, and I want to kind of get the elements that are going to be represented by that value in. You know, you see it more on Kitiara than on some of the other ones, but where I block in, you know, large areas of her armor that, you know, are going to be blue or black. With Lorana, you'll be able to see it a little more in the skirt that she has there, where I'm just able to kind of get that all in pretty quickly. Now here, you know, for the most part, again, my detail brushes, this is a number 2 round that I use a lot that you see, and I also use a number 2, I think it's a number 2 filbert quite a bit, which is what I'm using to do a lot of the fur in this thing. And you know, both the filberts are great for laying in bigger areas, but also being able to get a point. So they kind of do double duty. The you know, the rounds are clearly for little pointy details. We're gonna speed the process up here just a little bit so that we can move this along a little more quickly. But you'll get the sense of, you know, how like the cloth itself, you know, it's basically a big shadow right now. It's a big dark, and I could have colored this thing in and you know, spent a lot of time with the graphite drawing, but to me the paint is just a more efficient way to get the white space covered, which is really the important thing at this point. I mean, until all of the white of the gesso is covered, I wouldn't consider anything to be moving into a final stage. You know, the painting kind of will tell you where to go after that. You know, you get to see the relationships that are happening and either exploit them or correct them depending on how you feel that they're going. But you'll see here, you know, this is a pretty small filbert, but I can get in to Lorana's skirt pretty efficiently and start to get the beginnings of what look like some cloth detail and things like that. At least for me, I'm not as efficient anymore with graphite, which is funny because I used to be, graphite was my sort of go-to medium for years when I was in art school, but Once I started painting, I never really went back to that as much. And again, you can tell the difference between, say, the staff, for example, some of the accoutrements around her waist, the dagger and things. They're starting to be set apart from each other by what is different chroma, what's different color coming out of that underpainting. In some cases, by mashing the white and black together, you can get something that's more gray or cooler than just a string of browns. But as you can see it develop, for me, it really helps start to define the piece. And I always have my reference off to the side somewhere. It's not always in the camera frame, but rest assured there is always some reference I'm looking at, especially for figures. In this case, I had a model, and I then went into Photoshop over that stuff. I photo bashed out the outfits and all of this kind of thing. Some of the faces were changed. Obviously, we can't have the same model for everything. And, that's how I came to the reference of these girls. And I should say that, I could kind of work some more of this stuff out in the piece, but by the time I get down to this phase, I really want to have my goals ahead of me. I don't want to be working too much out in the oil painting stage. And again, now, as we get in the gold moon, I mean, it's the same thing that I've said before, which is that, I like to start with the eyes and the mouth. Usually try and lay the darks in, especially with a woman's face. The darks are something that you want to try and use sparingly. Keep things kind of soft, not a tremendous amount of shadow detail around, say, the bridge of the nose and things like that. Really looking to just see the eyes and the lips generally, from a distance. So I take and these heads are they're a little bigger than a quarter or something like that. So they're still, even though the piece is a fairly decent size, the faces themselves are not huge. These are not big portraits. So they do take a little time to get in there and noodle around, and you can see, like here, I have one of her eyes is looking a little off. So I get in there and try and straighten that out. Okay, so we get into the dragon. The dragon's name is Sky. And at this point, you'll see where I sort of block in kind of a washy way, some burnt sienna. Now this is loaded with liquid and thinner. And I have a bunch of rags around all the time too, which is just a cut up. Usually I just use cut up t-shirts, which is great material. It's absorbent, but I mean, it's great to have a pile of that around for wiping stuff off and wiping your brushes in and all this kind of thing. So again, the value on Sky here, Sky the dragon, not the sky. I'm just going to refer to the dragon as the dragon, so that doesn't get confusing. But the pattern on the belly of the dragon is unique and darker, this dark brown color. So by starting with this sort of wash color, I can get a little darker with a burnt umber. But again, it's really about covering the white at this point. And then you'll see once the white is covered that because this is now a big wet surface, I'm able to draw into it with the scales pretty quickly. Again, I've said this before, but you can see that I move pretty quickly over the silhouette of the dragon, but I can still see my drawing through it, the pencil work. So, I know that I'm going to go back and kind of tighten some of that up later. You can wind up tripping over yourself trying to keep some things, so clean as you go. as long as you can kind of see what you're doing to get back there. And if worse comes to worse, you can always just draw it from scratch. I mean, we do know how to do that. So, there's always a way out. But now you can see where, now that I have a basic value of the dragon in, I can start to, just in 2 values, even in this case, the dark burnt umber there, over the sienna, the more orange color, starts to really give it some form and give it a shape that, again, takes it to the next stage from where it was in just a linear graphite study. Sometimes too, especially with horns and things, this can be the beginning of some texture that ultimately shows through in the final piece. Especially if these colors sort of lend themselves to brown bone-like color. But here, then I just start picking away at the scales, and scales. I try, while they do have a pattern to them, it's not a very specific mathematical, like grid-like pattern. I mean, it does have, it definitely does have a pattern to it, but in nature there are little nuances that are just irregularities, and to me that helps lend a more natural feel to the dragon as opposed to this, real regimented grid system. So while I do loosely lay a grid system on it at first, I then go back and kind of pick away at putting in the scales. And if it starts to come out a little different or one looks a little odd, a lot of times that works. So I wanted to say that about the scale patterns too, because I've seen folks that just really keep this grid, and it I think it doesn't look as realistic to me. Hi everyone. I have something new and that I hope you'll find as exciting as I do, part of my Dragons in Nature series. I'm doing a large format, limited edition art postcard, which I promise will be in your mailbox by Christmas if you pre-order by December 10th. Again, this is part of my Dragons in Nature series, and it's just a way for me to get a dragon in your mailbox. Thank you. Okay, so again, I just want to take a second to say that, if anybody has any questions, or if I'm creating questions, please leave them in the comments and I'd be happy to do my best to clarify anything. Now we've sped the video up again here a little bit just to move things along, but the underpainting, we've jumped ahead a little bit. So the underpainting is pretty much done. The underpainting of the figures, I should say. Now, a lot of the background elements, I'm not going to do a full tonal lay-in like I did with the figures. I'm just going to dive right in the color, but I still kind of consider this first pass to be, an underpainting of sorts. The color can be altered, can be adjusted through subsequent layers. But again, this is my main goal here, is to cover the white space. Now I'm using a larger brush. This is a flat, probably about a 3/4 inch flat. And again, the flats are great. I mean, they're great for laying in bigger areas like this, but you can get them on their side, and you still have some control over the shape, some detail, just different shapes and marks that you can make with it. And you can see as I'm laying this in that I think there was 3 or maybe 4 colors on the palette here. So I have the blue, I have sort of a middle dark bluish green gray color, and then I have a real light color that I use here that you can see. I'll start to work around Kitty Ara's head, and then I have the lightest pale yellow. Uh, the pale yellow in this case, I tend to lean on Naples yellow more so than cad yellow on my palette. It feels a little more natural. It's more of like a corn yellow than a real punchy yellow. So, um, it's personal taste, but I'm sure that this is a derivative of that. The yellow is that in white. Um, and the blues again, phthalo blue is just, one of the mainstays on my palette. It's uh, neutralized with either a Payne's gray or maybe a little burnt umber, which can go a little green. But in this case, that's oddly, what we're kind of shooting for. Um, the transition between the yellow and the blue, I mean, you're going to have to, if you ram yellow into blue, you get green. So that's going to be in the transition. In this case, I brought the chroma of that green down, and it's more neutral. I like to try and, again, cover everything without blending it too much at first, just to get the color or the edges in with the different colors. And you can see still that the paint is pretty thin. You can still see through to the underpainting, even though there are areas that go over top. So oil paint, it really is a thin, transparent medium. I use this is a very large watercolor brush that I use as a duster. I dust down the oil paint, and by that I mean blend. Essentially. Now, when I do this, you can kind of see that I make kind of X's on the thing. I'm not trying to really put in any brush work. I'm just trying to blend what paint is there. So I'm really just trying to make some of the brush strokes. I'm trying to soften them and make some of them go away in some cases. So it's a very soft brush that I go out of my way to keep very clean. That I use for this purpose. Here we are getting down to the nuts and bolts of it a little bit, and I'm going to start, basically the first pass on the figures in color. So the palette of flesh, it varies from situation to situation. Usually, there's white, some yellow, some burnt sienna. The shadow color, I like Mars Violet out of the tube. It's kind of an earthy violet, which is great for the shadow color. And we're going to speed things up so that we can move along a little more quickly. But regardless of the color, the color can always be glazed into later and warmed up, or have it be made cooler or whatever. So the color, especially the first little bit of it, is really a little more arbitrary. It's about seeing, how that looks, and then we'll make adjustments from there. But again, you can see that, I kind of lay in the darks, but I try and be sparing about the detail and heavy value work in some of the secondary and tertiary forms, things like the bridge of the nose, the laugh lines. These are things that, especially in a female portrait, you want to kind of play down a little bit. We want to soften these up rather than make them more harsh looking. Those details can tend to make a figure look aged, and tend to just, honestly, they work better if you're doing a portrait of a man as opposed to a portrait of a woman. I generally, too, just mix up a general dark. I've heard people refer to it as mud in plein air painting, and it's usually a dark brown violet of some sort. But it just, again, once you get down into something that dark on the palette, the chroma doesn't show through as much. They tend to be, it tends to just read as it doesn't read as black, but it reads as your dark. So, it lets you work the edges, which you can see that, as I work around the hair, the edge of the forehead and the jaw and things like that, I'm able to soften some of that just by having a general dark, and I can always go back into that later and pop some highlights and things in. At this point, I'm using Payne's Gray as my black, essentially, my palette. It's a very dark, sort of neutral blue. It's in the blue family. It's a great right out of the tube color to use for this kind of thing. It still gives me, I still have a step or two to go with a black if I feel like I need it. But it's great to have a dark in here just to give me some wet paint to blend some of the edges into around the jaw and the neck and areas like that. Now, getting into the detail here, you can start to see more colors that are added to the, what started out as a phthalo blue mixture. It also has some violet, adding the darks. The dark has Payne's Gray in it again, but we're starting to work on our cape and different areas like that blending in. So again, the Payne's Gray, using that as a black, it gives me, I can get right back to it. So that's what the shoulder armor is laid in with. So I can grab that color again and just blend those edges if I need to, that you can see I kind of pick away at it again and again to sharpen those up. Now here, you can see I just wiped that out. It looked, I take a rag to her armor, but I think that's just because the paint was too opaque on the first pass. I wasn't leaving enough of the underpainting seen through it so that I could come back. But this is one of those cases that I had mentioned earlier where I lay in this sort of a thinner version of this dark blue, which has medium in it. I'm sure it has some liquid in it at this point. Linseed oil, probably liquid and linseed oil at this point. I get away from using thinner the further I get into the painting. But you'll be able to see here that as I start to work on these scales now, I'm working into this wet dark blue. So I'm able to blend the edges, and I also don't have to worry about a dryer per se in the details because of the dryer that's in that initial sort of block in, I'll call it. I'm really only worried about medium in the paint just to get it to flow, but not to get it to dry, which is nice because again, that sort of allows the palette itself to have a little more life, especially if you're mixing, a lot of colors that you want to get a little more mileage out of. And most of the time through this kind of stuff, I'm using my two favorite detail brushes, the filbert, the smaller filbert, and some smaller rounds. One thing else I noticed here that you can see on Kit's outfit is that most yellows are transparent, and I've glazed over the white gold piping. It was white in the underpainting, but it's gold. It's going to be gold eventually. And I just glazed over that just to get us a little bit off and running with that. Now, I just happen to be, as I'm watching this and explaining this process, I noticed that we kind of skipped over that, and it was something that I had mentioned earlier, and I wanted to point out now. And at this point too, with the face and this pass in general, this first color pass, sometimes you can get very close to finish with this. And I'm trying to kind of take it as far as I can, but I realize that most of the time I'm still going to wind up going back in and putting in a real, dark somewhere, or a highlight that, is just maybe not gonna be able to stay as pure if I mix it into wet paint as it would if I go into it dry in another day or so. So those are the things I'm kind of considering. Again, while I want to try and take it as far as I can, it's about taking it to the next step in the piece. And, we're really in it at this point. And am trying to take things, as far as I can. But it's also hard to tell how finished things are until you get more of the piece laid in. So you kind of fight those two things, whether the horse is in front of the cart or not on that particular issue. Okay, so again here with Tika's portrait, we're kind of noodling around, laying the value in, and at this point I'm a little more confident with the palette since I've already got Kit's portrait laid in. So I know the colors are working. I know there's a little more red that needs to go on the cheeks and some little flourishes like that I'm going to do. But essentially this is just putting in the time. Again, referring back to my reference quite a bit and just trying to be aware of all the secondary form that takes place again, in a female face, trying to play down things like the laugh lines and some of that kind of stuff. We really want to see the eyes and the lips primarily, from across the room. Now, in the case of the portraits, you can see where, they become a little more refined, but the basic value and everything, of course, was established in the underpainting stage. So it really is just another level of detail that we're able to achieve here with the final palette, which I'm sure probably had a little wider range of value mixed up. Probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 tones as opposed to the 4 or 5 that I use for an underpainting. Now here's a pretty good example of, once the things are laid in value, you can see with the red, and I think this is a combination of something like alizarin crimson and probably has some burnt sienna in it just to warm it up a little bit more. But how quickly that starts to look finished just with a glaze of those colors over it, because the value was so, accurately established in the underpainting. And, not that it's even 100% right at this point. I mean, I'll still go in and pull highlights out and put in darks and stuff down the road, but it really, all of a sudden, there's the red cloth. And at this point, with a subject like this, where you have 4 characters that all have a lot of little details to their costume, it just helps things move along a little more quickly, and I can identify all of those little details and parts of the costume more easily. Now again, here we are starting on the dragon, the dragon's color, I should say, and you can see there where I just wipe things out with a rag if I don't like them. That's one of the advantages to having the underpainting and the underlayers in general dry before you move forward. I can always kind of wipe back to that area. In this case now, the dragon's name is Sky in the books. The dragon is blue. So, we have some knowns there that we're working with. Again, the pattern on the belly of the dragon is very unique, but has been depicted that way for many years, not just by myself, but from many other artists as well. So, and you can see where, I'm just glazing over the warm brown tones now with a blue, a thin, transparent blue. And at this point, I am starting to become more selective about how I'm painting the edges, the top of the dragon. I'm being more careful about that stuff, not just going over it all willy-nilly. So it's starting to really define the outline. But again, this will be the first pass, and it gets you pretty close. It really gets the dragon in the piece. And again, right now, my enemy is the white space or what's left of the underpainting. So I'm really just trying to get all the color in. And then I can judge whether things need to be slightly darker, slightly lighter, or even needs a shift in color. Usually also, if I'm going to block in something like this dragon, and then I know I'm going to go back over that and work out a lot more secondary detail down the road, I sort of plan my schedule so that, I know I'm going to block this in, and then that's probably all I'm going to do for that particular day on the dragon, and give the glaze a chance to dry completely. And again, when I do the transparent glazes, usually, even if it's later in the piece, I do still add liquid to it, which just ensures that, again, we're going to be good and dry the next morning and ready to go without fear of wiping any of that out. Now, the foreground in this piece, while I did do some compositional mock-ups in Photoshop, I really don't have any drawing to go by. And I'm going to approach this in more of a plein air style. I'm just going to block this thing in kind of off the cuff. Now, I do have reference. You can see some of it off to the left. That's not the only piece of reference that I had. I had about 4 or 5 different pieces of reference for this foreground and this sort of rocky field, rocks and grass type of texture. We'll speed things up a little bit here so that it moves along a little more quickly. But I'm really, at this point, just drawing in oil paint. If I don't like it, I'll wipe it out or I'll paint over it. But again, my biggest goal at this point is just to cover the white. Hopefully to cover the white with some idea of knowing what I'm doing, but sometimes it just takes blocking it in to sort of decide what you're doing. Once you get it in, then you can say, well, this works or this doesn't work. So again, and at this point too, I'm back to one of my larger flats. I think this one's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch, which is kind of, what I feel to be a comfortable size to block in an area. I'd be interested to hear what other folks use to block stuff in. I'm always looking for alternatives to the way that I do things now. But again, not just in deciding what the background itself is, but deciding how it works in creating focus on the figures. And by that I mean there's all of these negative spaces within the figures, so they have to be, or I want them at least to be something that helps project the figures forward in certain areas, especially around the upper bodies and the faces. Certain areas down around the feet and things like that, I want them to sink into the composition a little more. So that's stuff I'm working on here. Sometimes it's as abstract as the value choice, the color and the value choice. And I'm, once I establish the palette, I'm just pulling stuff off the palette and blocking things in and seeing what it looks like. So this is a little looser approach, and as you can see across the middle area of the painting, I have the distant mountains just blocked in a basic sort of shadow value blue. These mountains in the middle ground are going to be greatly affected by aerial perspective and be influenced a lot by the sky color. Also, as I'm painting the grass area, I'm just getting a feel for the technique too. I don't want to paint everything as tightly as I'm painting the figures. My personal feeling is that would just create kind of visual confetti. You need some places in the painting for your eye to be able to relax a little, and some areas that are not as rendered. It's about creating a balance between those two things for me. Some of the areas, like, in the clouds, I feel like I can be a little brushier and a little more gestural. The rocks and the grass, I feel that way as well. And then obviously as we get into the real detail, the figures and the faces and upper bodies, armor, stuff like that, the detail becomes a little more involved. Now again, as I'm laying in this, since I went right into this, I could have laid the rocks and the grass in the brown palette that I used to do an underpainting. But I knew I was going to have to take a couple passes at this anyway, so I just didn't see a reason not to start with the color. Even though it will get a little darker, a little more intense right away, it just lets me see whether that's working or not. And I'm also kind of warming up sort of a grass technique. You know, how tight do I want that to be? I mean, I don't want to paint every blade of grass, but I want to suggest that information is there. And I'm also, you know, one of the things about this, the ground itself that's important is that, you know, it's the thing that ties the figures into the piece and grounds them into the piece. So they have to look like they're not floating above it or anything like that. So you're looking for shadows and, you know, how the foot may fall into the grass, for example, or something like that. So, you know, it's an important area. It just isn't quite as polished as the figures themselves. You can also see throughout the thing that, you know, I tend to hold a bunch of brushes in one hand, lean on my wrist. I'm still using the maul stick quite a bit throughout. I do hold the brush in my teeth, even though, you know, you shouldn't do that. So some of this will be an example of what not to do. So just one more time, I want to say, you know, if you have any questions or comments, you know, I'd love to hear from you guys. I'll answer any questions that you have, and I hope you enjoyed it. Hi, I'm Matt Stawicki, fantasy illustrator and Dragonlance fan and artist. Dragonlance has been a big part of my career and something that's always been near and dear to my heart. I recently finished a private commission that was titled The Ladies of Dragonlance, and we will be offering through my site, mattstawickishop.com, 13 by 19 archival prints, both with and without remarked drawings on them. Pre-orders will be available until December 10th. So if you're interested and want to get in early, that's the way to do it. If you have any other questions, the answers will be, again, at mattstawickishop.com. Thanks again. See you soon.